Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. I want to talk about is licensing. Now licensing is a very hot button word for libertarians. What does the word licensing mean? The word license really just means permission. So when you get a license from a government body, you are getting permission for something. So the reason why I want to emphasize that is because it helps understand when is licensing appropriate, inappropriate. Now for example, let's say you owned your own bar. Okay, it would be totally appropriate to say, hey, if you want to come to my bar, you need to get a license, in the sense that you have certain requirements to become able to patron this bar. It's kind of like if you go, but you probably wouldn't call it a license, you'd probably call it like a membership, or probably a membership, because there's a better connotation to it. But it's the same idea. There's rules regarding getting permission to do something. Now, with government, there are different times when it uses licensing that is within the realms of power, and other times where it's just sort of beyond the pale. How do you think through it? What is the license for? So for example, a driver's license. When you get a driver's license, you're not getting permission to drive. If a driver's license was permission to drive, then that would be wrong, because then you're just saying, hey, I need to get permission to use my own property. That's a problem. What a driver's license is permission to drive on public roads. The problem is, when we use the term public property, it's very misleading. At the end of the day, the easier and the more proper way to think about it is it's government property. You don't get a direct say in it. It's not public. It's government property. So you got to treat the government as you would treat any property owner. So in the sense that it could grant permission and withdraw permission on use of its own facilities. And this is likely what would happen if you did have private road operators. Chances are, if roads were privately owned, companies would still be worried about things like insurance if there's an accident, worried about safe driving on the roads to minimize their litigation costs, etc. So they would probably organize something similar to a driver's license to make sure that you're allowed on the roads. They probably would have rules regarding having insurance. We don't have a system of private road operators right now, but one can easily imagine that they would take these steps to be prudent about the use of their property. So when it comes to things like a driver's license, it's very similar to what I would expect to happen if it were privately operated. But when you talk about occupational licensing, that's a different story. You're no longer asking permission to use public or government property. That's one thing. Now that you're asking for permission to voluntarily exchange with someone else, that's a problem, because you have the right to freely volunteer or voluntarily exchange with someone else. Okay, you have the right to if someone wants to pay you to braid their hair, you have the right to do so. And so when the government says, hey, you got to get a license for something you could otherwise do for free, typically. So basically, the only difference between doing it legally without a license versus doing it legally with a license is whether you charge for it. So when people say it's about safety, it's disingenuous, because then you would have to say you can't do it at all without a license. But oftentimes you can do these things for free. It's just as soon as you do it as a business that it becomes something that you require a license for. And really, at the end of the day, these licenses typically don't exist for any other real effect other than to protect the wages of incumbents, meaning to protect the wages of people who already braid hair. So that way, people who want to come braid hair can't undercut them, can't compete with them on price, so that way the older incumbent business interests win. To limit competition, to create barriers to entry. Which, people do this privately as well. People form unions, people formed guilds in the past. People do try to erect barriers to entry for the purposes of their own interest. But the difference is, once government gets involved, they sort of block off all other exits. They make the effects of that more pernicious. So this is why things like occupational licensing are really bad, because you're creating barriers to entry that there really is no way around, because government's basically enforcing it. They're creating a monopoly, and how do you get involved in this industry? At the same time, they protect incumbents, which give incumbents oversize political power, and at the same time limit upward mobility of those who could use these opportunities the most. Because those who are doing a little bit better off can afford to deal with the licensing requirements. It's those who are worst off who can't afford to deal with the licensing requirements. So you kill upward mobility, you actually create inequality with occupational licensing. So hopefully this video helped you think through the issue of licensing a little bit better from a property rights perspective, and understanding, like, I can give permission and I can limit permission for use of my own property, but I cannot sit there and control how people use other people's property. So that same standard should be applied to government. And the idea is when you start applying sort of property rights standards that we apply to ourselves to government, it's just making it very clear when government oversteps on its bounds. So my name is Alex Merced from alexmerced.com. Have a great day and enjoy.